Good afternoon to you all. I'm really delighted and thrilled to welcome you to this first session of our webinar series, Understanding the Social Question in the Middle East and North Africa. It is organized by the Center for Social Sciences Research and Action. So, مرحبا بكم للكل. While we are still waiting for somebody to connect, I will introduce a little bit this section. I am Michele Scala. As you all know, the session will host a talk given by Dr. Leyla Dakhli, that will be discussed by Nada Triqi, that I would first of all like to thank for their kind participation. The talk will revolve around the relations between International Monetary Fund programs implementation and the breakout of local riots in Tunisia during the 80s. But of course, this will invite to a broader discussion of the social impact of IMF and the International Monetary Institution policies in Tunisia today, also in terms, of course, of social mobilizations. Before to shortly introduce to you to our speakers, I would like to remember that you have the opportunity to get the translation from English to Arabic in the bottom part of your Zoom program. So feel free to get advantage of that if you need it. As per our speakers, so Leyla Dakhli is a full-time historian in the French Center for National Research, the CNRS, and she is presently based at the Bloch Center in Berlin. Her work tackles the study of Arab intellectuals and social history of the South Mediterranean region, with a particular focus on the history of women and the question of exiled intellectuals and activists. She is also the principal investigator of the ERC founded program DREAM, Drafting and Enacting the Revolution in the Arab Mediterranean. Her latest publications include L'Esprit de la Révolte, Archives et Actualités des Révolutions Arabes, that has been published at the Édition du Seuil in 2020, and a co-edited book with Amin Alal, Leyla Bamara, Giulia Fabiano, which is called Cheminement révolutionnaire, un an de mobilisation en Algérie, 2019-2020, that has been published at the CNRS edition in 2021. As per Nada Triqi, she is a Tunis-based political economist, graduated from Tunis Business School. She has worked as a parliament observer with Al-Bawsala, which is a parliament monitoring NGO. She has also worked as a journalist with Bar al-Aman Research Media on issues related to transitional justice, social and economic justice, food sovereignty, and consumer organizing, as well as social movements. And she has joined the team of the Tunisian Observatory for Economy in 2022. As I was saying, as a start, and before giving the floor to Dr. Leyla Dakhli and Nada Triqi, I would like to spend some words on the idea of this webinar series to make you understand why and how we have decided to frame a webinar around what we call a social question within, namely, the framework of our social justice programs implemented at the Center for Social Sciences Research and Action, as we in fact think that a reflection around the reconfiguration of the social question is much needed in order to understand the framework of current and past social justice demands in the region. As we know, social justice demands such as the denunciation of clientelism or corruption intended as emanations of inequitable redistribution of wealth, work opportunities, health, and economic security have constituted a common framework of the Arab uprisings that have occurred during the last 10 years. From that perspective, of course, the Arab uprising have not only pointed out to people's social precarity, but also to a more general crisis of legitimacy we could say, of the authoritarian regimes and of their social contracts. At first, we will remember that for many, the Arab uprisings have come as a big surprise and have disoriented in the meaning of depriving of Orientalism, long-standing approaches postulating the stubborn persistence of authoritarianism in the region, and also the apathy of the societies of this region. However, a growing literature has widely highlighted the genealogical and processual nature of the revolutionary experiences occurred in many Arab countries, showing how often overlooked forms of mobilization have preceded, prepared, and sometimes accompanied the Arab revolutionary processes. Often framed around, at first glance at least, material demands, this sectoral and yet iterative phenomena of mobilization, such as workers' struggles, unemployed protests, as well as riots, social movements, or campaigns, have pointed out throughout history to a progressive erosion of the authoritarian social contract and of its moral economies. The current revival of authoritarian practices and regimes in the region has, in fact, not eradicated social demands or ended social protests throughout the region. Rather, it has pushed to the reconfiguration of contention practices and mobilizations driven by demands for social justice. So, in other words, we could say that at a close examination, the progressive erosion of the authoritarian social contract and story of past and present forms of mobilization call for a more general understanding of what we can call the social question and of its progressive reconfigurations in the Arab states. So in this perspective, I think that Leyla Dakhli, today's talk around the so-called bread riots that broke out in Tunisia in 83, 84, following to structural adjustment programs, will constitute a perfect example of how the neoliberal shift of Arab countries' political economies has contributed to both the erosion of the authoritarian social compact and to the reconfiguration of a social question in Tunisia. Of course, the social impact of structural adjustment policies, and namely the government decision to remove subsidies on basic goods at that time, was huge. As she will show, as Leyla will show, far from being merely bread and butter mobilizations, the so-called bread riots did put into question the authoritarian regime social contract and its moral economies. So the teachings of that experience are very much relevant today, as the financial orthodoxy laying at the bottom of structural adjustment plans has not really changed since, as shown by the recent agreements between the International Monetary Fund and Tunisia, or the International Monetary Fund and Lebanon just some days ago, that have already brought to forms of social mobilization. So without telling you any more about today's talk and today's discussion, I will now leave the floor to Leyla Dakhli to present her very topical work. So thank you for attending to this session. Leyla, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michele, and thank you for the introduction. Well, indeed, I will be here talking about something that I actually already published, so I don't want to repeat what I wrote and published, and it's also free for you to access. So we're going to post it on the chat as soon as possible. So this is my presentation of a work I did last year about these food riots, as they call them in English. And part of the discussion is about like the fact that we call them food riots, actually. But let me first start after saying thank you to all of you, and specifically to Nada, who's going to discuss with me, maybe not discuss me, but with me. I'm sure this discussion between what happens today and what happened quite some decades ago in Tunisia would be really interesting. Let me just present the context of the work I did, and it's part of a special issue of the journal, the International Review of Social History, which was dedicated to this question of the structural adjustment programs and how what we called adjusted people reacted to them in the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to go back to that because one of the points is actually to focus on these spaces to talk about this adjustment programs, because most of the studies that have been done previously on these questions were focused mainly on other parts of the world, specifically South America, which has led to very interesting literature on not only on structural adjustment programs, but also on the collusion between changes, political changes and structural adjustment programs, and also on the collusion between social movements and social riots and structural adjustment politics. So we felt that like our parts of the world lacked this kind of analysis of the intersection between social revolts and let's say global scale economic changes. And this is not completely contentious. I mean, it's also, there is something to be understood in the way we actually tended in the literature to neglect the link between social riots and economic change in the region. I will come back to that. So the global context is, I think, well known. We are in the beginning of the 80s, late 70s, beginning of the 80s in the region, confronted with a big change in a turning point in the economies of the countries, and specifically of these countries who were recently independent. And for most of them, chose to begin their new economic policies with a trend of, let's say, controlled socialist-like economy, and then turned to another kind of economy in the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, or the dates differ in the different countries, let's say, with some kind of liberal turn that I'm trying in the paper to describe for the case of Tunisia. So what happens is that the context and the scales of analysis of these adjustment policies are very interesting to understand together. Understand that this comes just a generation after the independence, but also understand that this is coming also globally and locally in the same times. And I think this is what makes it also very particularly critical also. What is well known that these policy of IMF and World Bank have been criticized since the 90s, specifically by a lot of social movement in the world, but also from inside these institutions. But this criticism has been focusing on what they call the effects of the structural adjustment in terms of public services, for example, but also in terms of policies and the way that this domination of the IMF and World Bank were actually affecting the public policies of the countries. What I wanted to do, of what we wanted to do in the whole issue, was to focus on the practical consequences of these structural adjustment policies in everyday life and the popular perception of them. Seeing that these criticisms were actually focusing on a level where supposedly nobody was supposed to understand what was really happening with the structural adjustment program. What we see when we focus on the revolts and the contestation is that there is a specific knowledge that comes from the people who actually are affected by these policies. And we also see that there is a long-standing reality of discontent with these policies, and we could also say with capitalism at large, or expressed in the popular mobilization and feelings, and also attempts at social responses to them. So what I tried to do in this piece is keeping together a history of power, of the policies, how they were implemented in the Tunisia of the beginning of the 80s. And one of the key points of this history of power is to understand, and I think it's so very important to keep in mind, that they thought they were doing the best. and like looking at it from now, we have a tendency to think, oh, okay, these guys were just like evil and they just wanted to put everybody in distress and misery. But if you just read carefully what they were doing and like the agreements they came to, you could say that actually this is the time where let's talk now specifically about the Tunisian government and the Bolivian government, was shifting from something that was the project of the independence, like a growing economy, like having schools and roads and hospitals for the people and so on, to another one, which is looking at the social reality and saying that like now we have to fight poverty. We have been like trying to get access to everything for everybody. So we have been building something that we now call the middle class. And we see that all these policies tend to not only to create poverty, but are not actually a good solution to fight poverty. And this is where we have to try to listen to what the documentation says to us, because this switch to the fight against poverty is one of the key problems of these structural adjustment programs, paradoxically. Because fighting poverty is, so the general thing is that like when you just compensate on the basic products, you compensate for everybody. So everybody is actually paying much less than what he should or she should for bread, milk, and so on and so forth. So the idea was like, we shouldn't be doing this anymore. So we should raise the incomes for the workers and stop this compensation funds for everybody. Okay, so in this history of power, taking into account that they were doing what they thought was the best, and they were also consulting, for example, the unions and so on. So you will have a raise in the incomes, but you won't have any more the compensation, so on and so forth. When they actually decided to raise the price of the bread, seeing this revolt coming was a surprise for most of the policymakers, of course, but also for part of the social movements, and first of all, for the unions, which is something that has also to be taken into account, seeing that in Tunisia, the last big revolt that happened was in 78, so not so long before 83, but was actually a general strike done and organized by the unions. So what happens in 1883-84 is something completely different, not coming from the unions, even if, of course, some of the parts of the social movement joined the revolt, but it was coming from other parts of society. And this is where in the paper I'm using also these categories that Chatterjee uses on what is actually doing politics in this context. The idea of having not only social movements, but like where actually stands the real demands for politics. So the second level after the history of power is the history of social movements, social history, let's say, in terms of who is in the streets. So who is in the streets in 83 and 84 is very different from who is in the street in 78, even if you can have a continuity. And in some of the documentation we have, some people explain that there is a continuity between 78 and 83. Those are very specific people, let's say, like most politicized people or militant people. But if we look at who is in the street in 83, 84, it's also a key to understand one of the way these events were interpreted by the power, but not only by the power, but also by part of society. So these people who are on the streets are seeing things and have, you were talking, Michele, about material demands. There is not so much about material demands in the streets in 83 and 84, apart from, of course, prices. But when we talk about prices, we're not only talking about material demands. We are talking about social justice. And this is what is really very clear when you listen to what was said in the streets in Tunisia in 83, 84. The government was talking about true prices. So the idea of stopping the compensation was explained by the fact that we should have true prices for the bread, if we focus on the bread. And the people were talking about fair prices. And it's really interesting to really try to understand what they mean by fair prices. And when you listen to the demands, the slogans, but also like the accounts that were done in the medias, the accounts that were done a lot of time after in the dignity and truth process, is that what they call, and what the people were calling fair price, was actually a compensation that has nothing to do with the IMF and World Bank, but a compensation for the price of their own work and their own and what they give and what they feel they give to the country. So it's related to some kind of implicit social contract between the government or the state and the people of the country. And this is not new. This is really relying on the social contract, the post-colonial social contract. These people coming to actually build also, or continue to build the country. So what they call, and the second aspect of this, of the fair price, one is the moral fair price, let's say the exchange between the state and the people. And the second one is more material, in the sense that like the price of bread is not the same for everybody, even with the compensation. When you look at the structure of what an average family spends for bread or for like to eat, let's say, you could see, of course, that like the more you pour, the more you spend for food. But also the more you pour, the more you spend also with this kind of basic alimentation. So the part of this, of the bread, let's say, to put it all together, semolina, bread, and so on, is bigger for the poorest in the country. So this fairness, the idea of like, if you can afford to eat more meats, or you can afford to eat more vegetables, so on, you will have to eat less bread or less basic food. So this is what we actually can very touch in a very specific way when we look at this period through a documentation that I actually decided to combine for my article with the more direct, I'd say, accounts of the revolts. This documentation is coming from the urban restructuration of some neighborhoods in Tunis, where they actually did a very in-depth inquiries on some of the neighborhoods. And you can see how these different material demands can articulate with each other. I'm not going back to this because this is most of what I'm analyzing in the paper, but I wanted just to put just this to say this difference, or to look at this difference, because what is a fair price and what is a true price for this what is called bread generally. The third very important aspect of this episode is repression. And I started also with this question, like the question about the fairness and the trueness of price came from this apparent paradox, which was, I know that in the same time there was this restructuration of all these poor neighborhoods, there was this fights against poverty, and in the same time this is the period where we actually saw the poor in the streets. So what happens when it comes in the same time? This is the first big question. And the second one is, how come there was such a big repression during the food riots and such a long repression after the facts themselves? I mean, there was, from what we know, there were more than 120 deaths in the streets and more than 1,500 wounded in the streets. But what is even more striking is that they actually stayed in prison, and the amnesty for them came only in 1988, so just after Ben Ali came to power. And even after the amnesty, some of them were actually banned from public service, had to register to the police every week. So this repression and control stayed for a long time after the events themselves. And this was one of the big questions for me also to understand. And this comes also, and this is also interesting, it comes with an official narrative about these events. And looking at these official narratives, and when I call it an official narrative, it's not only Mohammed Mzali, the prime minister at the time, or Bourguiba, but also larger parts of society, let's say like the middle class, upper middle class, which was looking at these events as with a lot, of course, of social contempt. This goes without saying, but also decided at some point to see it as an Islamist conspiracy. And I think it's very interesting, but this is also what makes it some kind of a turning point in the region, and specifically in Tunisia. We knew about the Islamists before 83, 84, of course, and it was also very much something that the power, the Bulgarian power, was instrumentalizing in many ways. But like for 83, 84, and this emergence of a popular revolt, we can see that like there were, Mzali specifically was completely focusing on this idea that these people in the street was actually potentially Islamic terrorists, was very pregnant in the media, in the official media, but also in the public conversation about the revolts. And I think this explains in many ways why these repression stayed in this scale of violence for so long. Because of course, many organizations were fighting for the liberation of these people who were staying in the jails and so on. But like the public discourse was that we were actually the power was officially preventing these people to act as they were supposed to be acting, as Islamist conspiracy or Islamist potentially terrorists. so these are three big questions that I try to put together in analyzing this specific episode. Of course, it's history, and I worked as a historian. I had to go, so I have to say a few words about the documentation I used. I already mentioned this Truth and Dignity Commission, also the media of the time, but also these archives of the urbanist, which gives you a very in-depth understanding of these popular neighborhoods and the way they were actually participating in the project of modernity, of the new modernity of the big, they call the big Tunis. So this is the documentation I have, but I think it echoes quite interestingly what happens, or what happened in the uprising of 2011, for example, but also, of course, what happens now. And I think what is maybe interesting for us to know is to try to not separate actually what happens at the scale of the global policies, so the level of the IMF and the World Bank, the way they actually negotiate with the governments. At the time in 83, 84, Tunisia and the IMF and the World Bank were actually good friends. Everything was happening in good terms. But strikes me now is also that like these guys seem to be good friends. So I mean, they still negotiate a lot. So having in the same time a look at what is happening at this level and trying to understand what the popular perception of these policies is doing, is saying, and constructing in terms of alternatives, in terms of like what actually should be an economy that takes into account not only true prices, but fair prices and more generally social justice. So this is what I wanted to say. I'm not sure. I think I can stop here if I want to discuss with you. I don't want to go back. I think you posted, Michele, the paper.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. So if you allow me to stop here, I think it's better if I go to the present days in the discussion.
Of course. So Nada will now discuss Leyla's work, and we will, of course, have the opportunity to come back to this latest topic that you brought out about how this tells us about what's going on now. Thank you, Nada.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Leyla, for the very insightful presentation, and I'm very happy to discuss or maybe add some points to the work from the perspective of the observatory and from the observation of parallels maybe between what happened ago and what happened in 2011, but also what's happening now currently as we witness a new negotiation with the IMF. And in the context of a re-reflection about the whole subsidy system, and we witnessing also the same arguments that were presented in the 80s re-emerging again since 2016 to justify maybe or to talk about again targeting from the perspective of governments of state support to consumption or to people, and how it is unfairly distributed since it is equally paid by everybody. So as the sister put it, the dictatorships try to muzzle after independences in the region people by the duality of consent and coercion. And within that dynamic, there is that constant negotiation and further definition of the terms of the social contract. We can think of various forms of popular negotiations. Beyond protest, we can think of internal migration and informal settling as formal negotiation for inclusion, and also informal economy as a form of negotiation. Things you went over in the article. In this negotiation, if the negotiation testified of something, it's of the fact that the frameworks or this contract we talk about that was established in the 60s is unable to absorb whole fringes of the population. So the neoliberal transformation in the 70s and the 80s, under the name of modernization, further narrowed the inclusivity of a social contract that already excluded some people. And maybe that was the surprising element in when we talked about the unexpected news for UGTT, maybe also because UGTT always considered itself as the representative of the people, while it only represents the organized part of the people and lets down a whole fringe. If I can go to 2011, it didn't start with the union. It started from the rural areas and then was captured and supported by the unions to get to the momentum that built up for 14th of January. So here I want to bounce on the similarity in the geography through which there was this surge and through which there was the anger started. It started from the rural, both in both moments. So in the 80s, it started in Douz, and 2010, it started in Sidi Bouzid, once because of the informal work, and once because of the fact that the most important parts of the increases concerned the very components of the food system of rural workers or rural people, and then it spread across the regions to catch, and the fire catches again in the popular areas at the outskirts of the cities. And namely here, you talked about Jbal al-Ahmar and Saida Manoubiya, and Tunisia was Tadaman, and it still is in the latest also protests in not so long ago. So I think here we can what is very interesting to me in the article is that exposes the different perceptions that the different actors had of what increase in the price was, from the perspective of the government and from the perspective of the actors, and how it can relate to the price increases that are happening now under the pressure of the IMF, especially when it comes to fuel subsidies. So fuel subsidy, when we talk about fuel prices, and it is not specific, I mean, in line or very comparable to food, but it still gives a parallel that is very interesting in how fuel prices pushes the general price of goods, of basic goods, up, and pushes inflation up, while generally the solutions of the IFIs to tackle inflation is only through monetary tools of increasing interest rates, which is not really a response. So to go back to the framing, the neoliberal. So we want to examine in this article in the acceleration of the pace of implementation of reforms pushed by the IFIs, inspect the possibility that the past informs us about the outcomes of what could happen in the present. So the article accounts by describing and scratching in the memories of protesters of the other side of the story that we don't hear too much. And by doing so, you have placed the bread riots in another register beyond resistance to neoliberal reform, as said properly like this, but as a struggle for social justice and for dignity, as mentioned maybe by a scholar Ayeb in 2011, as a precondition to be and to do. So this is relevant to our context in two moments for me. It's relevant to our context in 2011 as a moment of transition, and in which Tunisia has fell under the prey fell a prey of the Deauville institutions, and also to the current moment of Tunisia after the 25th of July, with the turn that took place with Saïd. I think that these are two very separate moments, even though not very similar in terms of how they were portrayed or how the popular responses were to them. So basically, as mentioned before, I think what the very interesting part, there's a very interesting part of description of the actors that enacted and were on the ground in the 80s, and if they were described through the eyes of the government, and they were described through their own lens, how they perceive themselves, but also there was this description of how their material conditions and how their relationship to the state was since the 70s, with the tensions that grew with the IFI, again, driven urbanization plans, and how it was brutal. I think this adds up to on these people beyond the injustice in terms of pricing beyond the content they have lived. It's a double taxation in terms also of the price of their housing and the price they have to pay to access the city, while they come from regions that are, I mean, these cities are informal settlements of people migrating from rural areas to access opportunities, so to fight unjust patterns of development in themselves. So it is interesting to see how they could not fit in the social compact right then, but they used that very interesting quote. You said, we will yell until the government looks at us. So so it is very important that we see that these people see they are doubly taxed, but they see totally their place and their misrepresentation in the system. We also you talked about specifically about students and about urban subalterns, as mentioned in literature, but there are also other actors that are interesting to look at and maybe it can be a field of work to look at in future works, the rural poor and the women workers. And both the four of them have problems or have in common the problem of misrepresentation in the spheres of decision and also misconsideration by organized institutions, whether would it be unions or government or state institutions. So, and the expression of these different movements were was different according to their knowledge and context. So some of them were saying Bourguiba the generous bring back the prices down. It is somehow a begging of the leader to save us, which echoes somewhat what is happening or the expectations the voters of Qais Said actually expect from the new leaders and the post-democratic transition we have in now. So others were rather very straightforward, and they were, we will break everything until you hear us. So different forms of expression to say the same thing, that people needed to be, they were angry about the price hikes, and but they expressed it in other terms. So to get back to what is interesting to mention in regards with what's happening today, it is specifically the fact that the reforms are still, as I said earlier, presented in the same manner as a redirection to the most vulnerable, and a supposedly fairer manner of redistributing the game, the game of redistribution. But however, in state reports, we find that, for instance, for the fuel prices, if we totally take off the subsidies for fuel prices, we will have in a report in 2017, we will have an increase of 3.6 in the rate of poverty. And also we will have the lower two classes will grow bigger. The lower two classes that are supposedly the target of these this refunneling operation. So basically, in technical terms, if we target let's say a small category of people like this, with the price hikes, it will grow bigger. How will we identify these people? How will we see if a family or two or more change from the category? This requires a lot of technical effort, and was and it's a criticism that had been addressed in one of the articles published by the Tunisian Observatory of Economy under the name Transitional Injustices by Jihan Shandour. So the mass of reforms, there's a mass of reforms like this that Tunisia underwent since 2011, and that carry the blueprint of IFIs. So the energy subsidies, reconfiguration of social security system, the devaluation of the local currency, the austerity and underfinancing of public services, all of them have impacted the general memory and triggered constant tensions between the state and UGTT, but also the manifestation of small protests here and there, but it didn't build up into something bigger. However, what was interesting is the emergence of this new political support since 2019 to Qais Said as an alternative to this political elite that could not come with a faithful answer to the expectations of the people in 2011, and construct really and to be up to the the challenge of this new contract that everybody consented to do, which means providing regional development and providing decent work. So at the moment, what we see is that there's a duality at the current level at the moment between the presidential discourse that is very into supporting the marginalized, saying الشعب يريد, the people wants, all about empowering the poorest margins of society. And on the other hand, what we have is a government that went to the spring meetings of the IFIs to present a program that is very similar to the conditionalities that always repeat itself and gets in the lines of the IFI's conditionalities. So are we reliving a new cycle of promise and then breaking up the promise and then repression? This remains something to explore, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you, Leyla. So, Leyla, I don't know if you want to react a little bit to what Nada has said before to open the discussion to the public.
Yes, I would love to. Thank you. That was really insightful and very, and the way you actually built it in response of the events of 80, 83, 84. I just have, let's say, two comments on the comments. One thing is that, like, there were at least 3 decades in between, and of course a lot changed, and this is why I actually ended my presentation with the narrative that came out of 83, 84, because I think it's very important to have this in mind, that this narrative of building social conflictuality, you call it Islamist or whatever you call it, or terrorism, or social danger in a way or another, this is what really comes as a new strategy after the food riots. There was a strategy, of course, of criminalization of social movements, but of organized social movements, being them leftist, nationalist, or even Islamist, or unionized social movements in many episodes of the new independent state, starting with the mid-60s, let's say, until late 70s. But this way of identifying, let's say, the marginalized classes with some kind of threat, of a political threat in the hands of, at the time, the Islamists. But you have to keep in mind that we have this big imaginary of what was happening in Iran in 79 and so on, and the war, Iraq-Iran, and all these what we are so used now with this kind of narrative that we don't actually think of the origin of it, like and the way, like, people were actually very deeply shocked by what they saw as the new model. But this is very important, the way this narrative actually enabled the state and a state that was more and more based on clientelism, but also some, and let's say also some kind of mafia style arrangements. So this state was going hand in hand with the new narrative, and like, yeah, using this narrative to continue doing business, and like bringing to the narrative new allies in the middle class. And also during these decades, there was this growing of liberal policies and authorities, because one could say also like these revolts showed us, or showed Tunisia, that it was a dead end. I mean, we couldn't do this. This was not the big solution. So of course, as we know, Bourguiba decided to go back to the price as it was, and then they decided to do it slower. But they did it, and they continued on doing what actually the IMF and the World Bank was asking for, and more than the prices and the bread and so on, the history goes on with the privatization of a lot. And I'm just mentioning in the paper the construction of the first private hospital in Tunisia, just near Jebel Ahmar, actually, the Tawfiq Polyclinic. But these are signs of what is actually happening and will continue happening in the decades coming. In 83, 84, we are just at the beginning, of course, of this privatization of the public services. And this is where also we can also discuss why they didn't stop doing this and why they actually found it better. And now we don't have to be fooled by the fact that actually they wanted to fight poverty. This is where also the big money came, this privatization. So we have like looking at that is also looking at like what actually the interests were in doing what the IMF wanted them to do. Because if you look at only at the fact that they actually wanted to fight poverty or do something against poverty, you could say, okay, they tried their best. But if you look at where they actually were making money, this is another story. So this is my main comment on what happened in between, let's say. And saying that is also saying that, like, in writing or thinking of the history of these periods is, let's say, that social history for me is a way to understand the general conception of the state. What you told something about these, how the state think of itself as a way to interpret or to negotiate, let's say, its own place in a global system. But I think it's also something that comes from the people. And as you said, this is very striking in looking at what's happening with the Qais Said now. Like the way, it's not really about him. Like he's not saying so, I mean, okay, he's doing things, and like we have people around like negotiating or explaining some kind of plans and so on. But what is really happening is that like there is a movement or popular movement building this guy as someone who is a leader. So it's very interesting to see also that I think the different waves of popular movement tended to implicitly give us a sense of what kind of state they would like to have. And this is very interesting. So I can see that, like, what is in, for now, at least, I mean, I can say something about Qais Said and the way like this is going somewhere, like structurally with the state acting as it is acting now. But I can also say something about like the way he's coming to power and the way like the hopes are expressed through him is also a way to do politics, if we follow Chatterjee in a way, do politics in a way that it's also very conflictual and very socially conflictual, like putting this this option in front of all the other options that actually failed before that. So yeah, I think I can stop here my comments on comments.
Yeah, thank you both. This was really really interesting to have those perspectives and those starting points as well. The work the observatory is doing right now, the work you're doing right now, or you have done not so lately. I mean, starting from another point of view, and how this informs us about a lot of things. So just to open the discussion, what I would like to maybe say is that I was really interested by this idea of fairness, which is, of course, we do agree about the fact that material demands are not only material, but they are eminently political. I mean, but the nuances that you are introducing here is that of fairness, and which shows that in a certain way, when you maybe switch the point of view from the social movements to the social question, at least what you can see is that social movements may differ, may be driven by different actors. The union is or is not involved. At what point it was involved in '83, at what point it was involved in 2011, how much it was contested just during the years that preceded the Tunisian revolution, and and then it became at a certain point one of the main actors of the revolution, the Nobel Prize for Peace that was given to the quartet, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what we do see, switching this point of view to the social question, is maybe that the social question and social demands are not new. Were not new in 2011, of course. What was maybe new in 2011 was about the priority that was given to social demands, the priority that was given to social justice, and the extent to which this could bring together people on a very, under the same slogan, Begash Ben Ali, but with very different paths that brought all of them to yell the same slogan. So I think this is very interesting, and also the other point that I find very, very important is that of the negotiation, the idea of the contract, because there is also a question that is coming about that. So when we talk about contract, we usually forget that also the dominants are negotiating in a way. So in a certain way, the fact that the compensation policies were blocked and then they came back a little bit, but under different habits, and they were, eroded, and they are being eroded today as well, tells us that the state is itself negotiating its nature. It's negotiating its power in a certain way. It's testing what is its role, what can be its role. Maybe. So we have this question among the Q&A here in the chat. I will read it to you. And of course, everybody feels free to add questions in this chat. So Paul Arts tells us, the term social contract is widely used in this session too. Would you agree that the concept is quite problematic in the MENA context? Why? Because the people never consented to the contract. Consent being a necessary condition for a contract to be a contract, but people were forced to accept this authoritarian deal. So I will maybe copy it here for you, Leyla.
I can see it.
You can see it.
Yeah, it's fine. Well, I'm not completely sure that you can't say that at least, as I said, I mean, in the 80s, you're just a generation after the independence, and there is something that could, at least in Tunisia, be considered as a social consensus, or consensus if you want, in the post-colonial area, in terms of what a new state, a new emancipated, modern is not the right word, but let's say a new independent state is supposed to look like, in terms of this kind of consensus, or could be, or for me, can be considered as something that looks like a contract between the people and their representatives. It didn't last much, and this is true. I mean, like the dictatorship came. I mean, the idea is not to give, I mean, a specific date for the time when Bourguiba became a dictator after being the leader. I mean, but let's say it's like really the beginning of the 60s, or when he just murdered the Yusufist. I don't know. Like, I mean, you can have different dates, but it's like, I think what is really interesting to look at is what kind of treason comes with. I mean, even if you don't have a contract, you have treasons. I mean, it's weird to say so, but I think it's true in the way, like when you still have a country where looking at, for example, if you just look at education and universities and schools and universities, until the late 70s, just before the 80s, you do have a growing educational system, with the first phase when you have like you have just one university in Tunis that brings the new, who is there to educate the employees and of the new state. And then it grows and grows, but it's still, until the late 70s, something that is manageable, and where you actually have not equal chances, but like a lot of people coming from popular origins that actually end up in the state, in the governmental schools and universities and so on. So this is what I call a contract. I mean, it's not only about democracy, or it's about democracy, but in a very large sense. It's not only about elections and being able to, even if Bourguiba is the leader, the only one, and so on, there is still, and he's actually still governing with different kind of people who he agrees are part of the deal, being them Salah, some part of the nationalists, and so on. So then after, this becomes something different. So as a historian, the idea is also to see the turning points inside the power, but also inside society. Inside the power, I mean, it's done. You can see like how he eliminates these opposants and so on and so forth. This is a very well-known story. But the turning point in terms of like the treason, looking at it from the perspective of the people, is my idea is that 83, 84 is one of the steps of this. This is where you can see it happening, the way actually the lots of parts of society, as you said, not only the urban poors I was looking at, but also the rural poors and some of the workers, consider, and this is not me saying it, this is them saying it. They don't say they don't say dégage, they say it in 2011, or just we want freedom or so on. It's really about like, just, this is not what you should be doing, because it's not fair. It's not fair in the agreement we had. The agreement, in this agreement, there is this idea of, okay, I'm going to come, for example, to Tunis and build my own house, and actually I can work illegally, but I can still work. And this is the agreement. It's not only about like, we have a state, it's modern, it has roads, etc. No, it's also, there are like this in-between spaces where everybody can find his own place. So yeah, I'm not sure I'm completely clear on that, but I think we need to think a lot more into these gray zones, because it's also happening now. Some people would say, like the state has to regulate what is illegal and not illegal, but it's also about that. I mean, like when Ben Ali left, he left with all these gray zones too. I mean, like how do you actually deal with that? Like being part of an implicit contract between the state and the people, being it the authoritarian state or a democratic state. It has to deal with that too. So yeah. Maybe Ned has something to say about that.
No, that was very, very nice. So are there any other questions from the public? Anybody that wants to jump in and ask a question directly to Leyla or Nada, maybe? Hello. All right. For now, there are no other questions, so I will maybe just add one other comment, and maybe Nada, if you have anything to add. Yeah.
No, I just want to say something at Nada, actually.
Go ahead.
Like what I was commenting on right now has to do also with one of the big relationship between the people and the state, which is taxation. And she said something about that. Like I don't mention it in the paper because my documentation didn't allow me to go very far on this. But you can understand like that these people actually having their own houses now and this infrastructure coming, it comes with taxation. So this is also something that is all the time negotiated between these popular fractions of the people and the state. So I think it's one of the key questions right now in Tunisia in many ways. Don't you think so?
Please, Nada. Nada, if you want to react to that.
Definitely, I think it has always been a problem, maybe between, even historically, even prior to colonization, taxation as a trade between what you give and what you take, and as your relationship with the state. You mentioned the fact that these people organized themselves automatically when they came in, settled, and tried to link themselves to the networks of the state, and then they had to pay for it, and then the state didn't have to do much for integration, just building on the efforts of these people, and also didn't have the space to extend social services in these neighborhoods because of the shortage in urban planning there. So it's normal for a citizen living there to question why would he pay taxes if services are not close to him. But in a larger context, also it is when we think of taxation, especially under IFIs, it is IFIs are promoting the taxation that is undiscriminate, and you know, the increase in VATs and VATs also is an increase on the general price without consideration of the various classes and the injustices that can happen without. So it's a very regressive measure that is pushed under the ideas of you know, fiscal consolidation and stuff like this, but that drive us again with the same idea of subsidies to more poverty, because from one side you decrease support to the people, and from the other side you increase the taxes that are that discriminate the people that earn the.
Nada, we have lost.
See again how the policies of the IFIs undermine the further the injustices, social injustices, and automatically will drive social movements.
Yes, there is something about this, because there is something about these social policies that are brought forward over technicalities, technical reports, technical issues, and what is lost in this kind of discussions about what we should, how we should finance a reform of social protection, of social safety nets, etc., social assistance, etc. It's always about technical issues, while what we lose is the fairness. That's why I was also mentioning the idea of fair value of the bread, the fairness that you introduced in your paper, in your presentation, because is exactly on that level that lies maybe the idea of a social question that can or not be tackled by social policies, and in that regard, the recipes of the IFIs have not changed over several decades, although we now know a little bit what is the politics of economy, to say that in this way, but and maybe so something that can help us also to go beyond the Tunisian case, especially that, well, you know, we are a Beirut-based center, and so the FME has just announced, the government just announced that they reached an agreement at this moment. Is that your paper is included within a special issue that is very, very interesting, because it tackles the question of the relationships between structural adjustment policies in general and social revolts. So what you were saying in the beginning of your presentation, in fact. Do you think that, so maybe it would be good for those who couldn't read the special issue that you came back to, you know, to that idea, to the fact that similar riots, revolts, etc., broke out in several Middle Eastern and African countries. And what do you see in that? Do you see, how to say, a break of the political economies of authoritarian, you know, authoritarian regimes, especially in the Arab world, but maybe not only? Have anything similar occurred in 2011, in 2019, during the last waves of Arab uprisings? Do we have something that we can read from that perspective right now and some decades ago?
Well, this is a very difficult question. I mean, like the last part of your question, this this whole question of like seeing it as a wave, as they say, is very difficult. Let me just first talk about what's happening at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s and 90s, if we look at the sub-Saharan Africa. I would say it's not only in the region, it's not really in the global south, where like this whole structural adjustment policies were implemented. So we had revolts and non-revolts in many places, because like we also look at like places where there were no revolts, but like some kind of resistance that led to a difficult implementation of the policies, specifically in the number. It's in the issue. It's about Ethiopia, but yeah. So here it's kind of easy to see the similarities, because you have a receipt that was actually coming from the IMF and the World Bank and applying to different contexts. And so the different contexts actually performed in different ways their hostility, resistance to what was happening, but also, of course, depending on the way the governments were implementing the policies. So in most of the cases, actually, they were implementing these rises of prices very brutally. So it's ended up with riots and protests in a very let's say classical manner. So this is, of course, the case of the big protest of '77 in Egypt, in '84 also in Morocco. It's like Jordan, I don't want to name them all, but what I found very interesting is the connection, coming back to the question before, but also what you mentioned right now, between the regime and so authoritarian state or regimes and the riots. And I think this is where we also wanted to dig into that, because it produced two things. I mean, it's coming in a moment where, of course, these movements, these regimes were already authoritarian, but they were not yet in the combination of authority and liberalism or neoliberalism that we saw in most of the cases in 2011, which is this new combination. So authoritarianism was combined with the more paternalistic kind of governmentality, we say that, in this post-colonial era. And this was let's say the last trend of this kind of paternalistic authoritarianism. And the structural adjustment programs and the way they were implementing them were also one of the most symbolical sign of the end of this paternalism. So it affects the regime, so it changes the way the regimes appear to the people, but it's also deeply changing the regimes in the way that they have to deal with, they actually have to find a way to survive with it, but also more than to survive, to take their own capacities and clientelism and so on from this new, it's not completely new, but it's like, investing in a different way in their own, their own power, like potentialities, or what do you say? So this has also consequences in other cases. So in the cases where we have dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, this is the New Deal, let's say. The New Deal has to take into account that this is going to be part of the symbols or part of the power of these dictatorships will actually rely on this deals with the IMF and so on, and these new governmentality of neoliberalism. But in other cases, in sub-Saharan Africa specifically, the adjustment came in the 90s and sometimes came with experiments of democracy. So it's actually impacted the way people trusted democratic regimes. And this is what is happening to us actually in Tunisia right now. So it's like, so now like we could put together or bring together, I mean, the idea that authoritarian regime were actually dealing with the IMF and like stealing from the people, which is fine. It has to, I mean, it's not fine, but you know what I mean? I mean, it's like they do it because they actually are dictatorship and they don't care about the people and so on. And they don't care anymore about the people, if you want to say it like that. But then when it comes with a growing democracy or democracy that it's trying to become more and more democratic, we hope it's trying to do so, then it's very difficult actually to understand. And it brings also a lot of protests that are against democracy. So it's also a big, it defies also our understanding of what is a democracy. Is it only a technocratic instrument that is supposed to deal with the IMF and try to have a new deal on the debt? Or is it something that is able to bring or to look at what I call the political people and look at what comes from the protests, or like to be able to address these questions. So I think this is one of the very important points. So I'm not answering your last question, but maybe Nada has an explanation.
Don't worry. Anyway, there are other questions, you know, so we are out of time, I have to say. Okay. So I will maybe wrap up the last two questions, and you can maybe try to address them as you can in 30 seconds. I'm joking, but we have the translators that have done a great job, and I would like to thank that may be tired after 1 hour 30 translation. So we have one question that is in the question and answer panel that you can read, and there is another one that is the following: as an historian, is it easy to access to archives on this subject, which could be sensitive for the authorities in Tunisia, of course, I think?
Well, let me answer the second one first. I mean, it's not difficult to access the archives of this period in Tunisia. I mean, there is a lot in the National Archives, and there was a lot that was brought also by the research done by the Truth and Dignity Committee. But then I didn't focus on the security or the Ministry of the Interior archives. So I don't know if it's easy to access. I know it's possible. I know it can actually, it's maybe a little bit recent to be accessible right now, like concerning the personal files. As you know, it's protected, but this is not only in Tunisia, it's always and everywhere. So yeah, I mean, what I found really interesting is that with what is available right now in the archive, and it's a lot, I didn't get into everything, you can have very interesting documentation to work on social movement generally, I mean, protests and so on. I'm not only working on this protest, and I can see that, like, compared to many other people, many other countries, sorry, in Tunisia, you can access a lot. So, and the other question, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so there is this idea of a vicious circle between like answering the demands of the IMF and then negotiating and then having protests coming back. I agree. I mean, like, this is why I wanted to discuss also what I discussed with Nada and about what happened in between. Like, so and where is it possible to act actually now and then, and going back to the question of taxation, going back to the question of infrastructure, of priorities. I'm not saying nobody is responsible. I mean, like, a lot of people are responsible of these policies, and this is also very interesting in doing social sciences. You can also say it was not so easy to answer this question at the time, and the pressure and the domination is very important. I mean, like, it's not that like they just come and tell you should do that. I mean, they're putting pressure on the governments. But at the time, and this is what I was saying, they were actually having kind of free discussions and so on. I mean, it was also possible to discuss and to put other questions on the table, I think. And this is where like the discussion about what is political and what is the responsibility in terms of political or policies or economic policies is there. So now we have people who know about policies and economics, so Nada can answer much better than I do.
Nada, maybe...
Yes, alternatives. So I think this is what we all look into to look for, and there's I think what came these days with the dead end that we got at this point of crisis. I mean, shortage in financing, risk of default, and degradation of downgrading of the sovereign ranking of the Tunisian economy. But the risk of default, a lot of people started talking about alternatives to these policies. But basically, to me, beyond the idea of having or not alternatives, and alternatives exist in several countries in the world that had experiences with the IFIs. It is about the policy space that Tunisia is left for Tunisia to negotiate another form of developing the economy beyond the conditionalities of these institutions in the current crisis. So I think there is very little room for negotiation. But many people think of ways of concentrating on local production, trying to reduce energy dependence and food dependence as ways to mobilize resources and get less dependent on debt. Also, ways to consolidate the fiscal administration to collect the taxes, to combat tax evasion. Also, reconsidering the tax incentives given to foreign direct investment. All of them constitute a body of alternatives we can build on to have a more comprehensive strategy that can lead us to conduct the economy in new ways that make us less dependent on debt and IFIs in general.
Thank you, Nada. I'm sorry, I'm maybe interrupting, but we are really out of time. So I would like to thank you all, especially Leyla and Nada, of course, and the translators for their great job. And thank you all for attending this session. Please keep posted on our website so that we can share the next sessions and talks within this webinar series. And so good afternoon to everybody, and bye-bye.